Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. There'll be more people coming, but you guys are on time, so we'll start on time. So good morning. If you could find your seats, we'll kick off our program. So welcome to the Thelma McMillan Recovery Center. I'm Dr. Mo Gelbart, the Executive Director. And thank you to all of you for continuing to support our program, not only our treatment program, but our educational programs like this one here. Thank you to the Meadows for continuing to partner. Cheryl, thank you. Is here from the Meadows, and you'll hear from her in a little bit. Also recognize a few people who are, we have a number of our staff members here, including Dr. Donnie Watson, who's our program director, and Therese Lang, who's our intake coordinator, and then thanks to Jamie Gelbart, who helps put these programs together. So this is just about our 30th year here at Torrance Memorial Hospital, and we're now part of Cedars-Sinai, so it's a great organization. There's lots of new changes, by the way, lots of additions in our program. You know, we're an intensive outpatient program. We have an adult program and an adolescent program. And some of the newer things we have a trauma-infused groups going on. We have mindfulness groups. We have our opioid specialty group that continues to be really important in this day and age. And we're starting to work on, we're kind of excited about some of the things. I'll tell you next time in detail, but our teen program, which is really very, very busy now, is we're starting to take teens on weekend outings, you know, kind of get out of the office a little bit, and it's really exciting. As I say, teens, there must be something going well. I think parents might be getting a little more aware of what's happening, but between, you know, vaping and marijuana and drugs and alcohol and screen time and all the kind of problems that teens are impacted by, you know, we are seeing really an explosion in our teen unit. And what we, hello? Is it on? Still on? Yeah. Anyway, is it on? No. What we try to do is what we call early intervention. As an outpatient program, we want to get these kids in when they're first starting to experiment, because the unintended negative consequences are really often severe. So you don't have to be an addict. You don't have to be, you know, by the time you go, a teenager goes down that road, you know, they pretty much have to go residential or wilderness or those kinds of programs. So we're really in the business of trying to get them in soon and work with the families. Let's see. We also have, you're going to be the first to see our 2020 Frontiers lineup, who we have next year. And I want to thank all the, you know, I don't know if you're aware, you know, we put on 12 of these meetings a year, 6 in here, 11, and 5 in our center. It's a lot of work putting on 11 conferences. And so I want to thank Cheryl Camby, Colleen Capistrano, Laura McIntyre, Dr. Watson, Jamie Gelbart, and is our committee with myself. And we get these speakers from all over the country. And again, our Frontier speakers are the best, really. They're all keynote speakers from conferences. So here's who you're going to see next year. Next time you come in November, we will have our flyers available for you. So let's see if this works. January 21st, Jerry Law, Intervention, Breaking the Cycle of Addiction with Love, Care, and Concern. March 17th, 2020 is Matt Torrington, Dr. Torrington. Not sure what his subject will be yet. He's a great speaker. We've had him here over the 20 years a few times. May 19th, Dr. Lauren Oslo, Let's Be Blunt, Concurrent and Sustained Effects of Adolescent Marijuana Use. July 21st, Dr. Denise Worden, The Brain-Gut Connection, Integrative Solutions to Consider in Addiction Medicine. September 15th, Deirdre Stewart from the Meadows, speaking on trauma. We don't have her exact topic yet. And November 17th, Andrew Susskind, It's Not About the Sex, Moving from Isolation to Intimacy After Sexual Addiction. So we have a great lineup again, and hope to see you then. Our next meeting, I don't have the flyer with me, but our next meeting is in November. maybe Dr. Watson, you can look at that flyer and call out the date, but it's going to be great. We have a really well-known author and speaker, Dr. Jamie Marich. I want to thank Anna Perkel, who's here in the front row, for helping put that together. But I have to admit I'd never heard of her in the past, but as soon as we got her, we have so many people looking forward to coming to that presentation that they know about her. I think she does TED Talks and all the rest. Anyway, that's in November. What's the date, Dr. Watson?
The 19th.
November 19th. Finally, we are recruiting for a very special person. We're looking for a marketing and outreach coordinator. We have some flyers in the back. If you know somebody or have some interest, have some experience in that field, like I said, we hope to get somebody local. So if you know anybody, take a look at the flyer and speak to myself or Dr. Watson. Okay, housekeeping. Now would be a good time to turn off your cell phones. If you are here for CEUs, and we give 2.5 free CEUs every meeting here, including free breakfast, so it's a great deal. But you do have to stay till the end. Okay, so if you leave early, we can't give you your certificate. There'll be a break in John's talk, but if you need to go to the restrooms, they're outside to my right, your left. And like I said, there'll be some breaks. Let me introduce our speaker, please. We're really pleased to have John Sovec, MA, LMFT, is a nationally recognized expert on the topic of creating affirmative support for the LGBTQ community, with his work featured on The Ricky Lake Show, OWN, Fox, The Advocate, YHTV, LA Talk Radio, Broad Topics, and regular columns for the Huffington Post and Good Therapy. In addition, John offers trainings to organizations, schools, nonprofits, and professional consultation on how to successfully support the LGBT community. John is the clinical consultant for the Life Group LA and is an adjunct faculty member at Phillips Graduate Institute. We're really pleased to have John here and talk about this topic, so help me welcome him.
Good morning, all. Good morning.
Good morning.
So I'm John Sovec, and I am a therapist, and I'm located in Pasadena, California, and I specialize in working with the LGBT community. So we're going to be together for a couple of hours here, and here's the deal. I could sit up here and talk for the next 2 hours, and eventually I would bore myself. What I want this to be able to be is a conversation. How many of you actively know that you're currently working with LGBTQ clients? Okay. How many of you suspect that you may be working with clients who are LGBTQ identified but have not come out to you so far? Okay. So it's really important to understand that these various populations might be in the places that you're working right now. And our conversation today is, well, how are we going to support this community in the most affirming way we can? So to do that and to make it easier for us to talk today, can we take this down a little bit? It's got a lot of ring to it. Thank you. The only ring I need is this one. Is that I want us to politely encourage that political correctness can go out into the front lot, hang out in the parking lot for a little bit, and leave the room. Now, why do I ask that? Because a lot of times we're trying to be really politically correct. What happens is we're not able to ask that question that might be really, really important for the room to hear because we're fumbling over how to ask it. So would you be okay if we put that concept during the next 2 hours? We're going to let political correctness take a vacation, okay? In its place, though, we need to make sure we have respect in the room and that we let judgment also leave the space. So those are kind of the 3 points that I want to have as we're starting today. You on board with that? Okay, cool. So why are we here? For me, my experience of coming out, I'm a cisgender queer man. My pronouns are he, him. Some of you may have understood that. Some of you that may have been Morse code will know all of that by the time we're finished today. My coming out process was really very easy. My parents were supportive. My friends in high school thought it was really cool to have a gay friend, and they were like trying to hook me up with people, and were very supportive. My journey was really, really, really easy. My husband, on the other hand, had a really challenging conversation. He grew up in Bakersfield, California. I wait for the room to go, oh. And his experience was much, much different than mine. He was verbally abused, he was physically abused, he was bullied, and he actually didn't come out until he graduated from college. One of the stories he shared with me that I think is the one that always grabs my heart is that one day his dad was picking him up after school. And they picked him up in the car, the windows were down. As they were driving away, a group of kids yelled "faggot" really loudly. And my husband and his dad drove home in complete silence because neither of them knew what to do with that moment. And a lot of the people that we're working with in our systems of healing and recovery may have had that experience. And that's a traumatizing experience. And we're going to be talking about the trauma of coming out in part of our conversation today. But with those two stories in line, who would you assume was probably the one who had the substance use disorder? Who was the one who probably used the most? Wait, what did I hear over there? It was both of us, actually. It's really interesting because even though my coming out process was very supported, for me, there was still lots of internal stuff going on, and substance allowed me a way to not have to deal with that. For my husband, it was a complete escape from the pain that he was going through. So it's very important to understand that substance is really, really something that we respond to when we're trying to deal with internal issues. So one of the things I like to do is actually look deeper into this coming out process. Because from a young age, we're finding that there's stressors that are showing up. So let's look at some of the most recent statistics about what it's like growing up gay in the US. So this is from the Gleason 2017 national study. Gleason is the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. And what they do is every 2 years, they put out this national online survey. 2017, I think they had over 13,000 kids respond to this. Because it's online, there's anonymity, so these kids are really honest with this experience. So let's see what's going on in schools. First of all, more than half of LGBTQ students said that they felt unsafe at school because of their sexual orientation. Remember, this is a place where kids are expected to go a minimum of 8 hours a day on a regular basis. Almost half of them said they felt unsafe at school because of their gender expression. So we're going to be talking about sexual orientation and gender expression to understand how those play out in school environments. Almost 70% of kids say that they were verbally harassed, that they were threatened or called names because of their LGBTQ identity. 30% of kids identified that they were being physically harassed, just like my husband's experience was going on. Almost 50% say that there was electronic harassment in the past year. I think this is something that we really need to be able to address on a deeper level, because it used to be, like when I grew up, maybe I was bullied at school or someone called me a name. I would go home, I would have dinner, I would hang out, I might read. Reading was my escape at that time. And then I would kind of process it, and then I'd go back to school the next day, and I'd be okay. But now, the bullying cycle can be a 24-hour cycle. And if you think about there's no respite from this process of bullying. And it's going on and on and on. How does one's mental well-being work under those conditions? Also, we're looking at almost 20 to 35% of LGBTQ youth interviewed said that they had made suicide attempts while they were in school. National average sits somewhere between 9 and 14%. And most of them reported this is directly related to their LGBTQ identity. Now, the Gleason numbers are actually lower. HRC and transgender care have numbers that go up to between 40 and 60% of suicidal ideation and attempts in LGBTQ kids. So whether you're a kid going through this right now or you're an adult who's had these stressors, this is sitting in your psyche. And we're really looking at this idea that these stressors these kids are going through make them more vulnerable for substance use disorders. It also makes them more vulnerable for high-risk sexual activities that could expose them to HIV or STIs. So all of these things are adding up, and this is how either kids are showing up in your facilities or adults may be carrying this as they show up. Also, it's interesting, the relationship of the LGBT community to substance abuse. What we find is that 20 to 30% of LGBTQ people are estimated to have some kind of substance use disorder. So we're looking at a disproportionately high number of the community that is turning to drugs and alcohol as part of their daily experience. Why is this happening? Well, LGBTQ culture, especially in a lot of the major metropolitan areas, does have a culture of party and designer drugs. There are these big raves that go on. There are these gatherings that come together. And it's sometimes that socialization factor. You know the first drink story? Like if I go into a bar, it's like I can't talk to anybody, but then I have that first drink and now I'm a little bit relaxed and I can come up and say hello to you. Well, this can take on an even bigger proportion in the LGBTQ community. Also, social settings tend to promote drug, alcohol, and tobacco use. So these are part of these social settings where I'm going to meet people who are part of my community. And then also, in the LGBT world, ageism, homophobia, and discrimination are rampant. So ageism. The joke used to be that when you turn 30 in the gay community, you became irrelevant. What I've been told now is it's actually down to 24. So as someone who is a 57-year-old man, how do I fit into this community? How to create my home with the people who are part of my world? Also, homophobia. Both homophobia that's coming towards the community and a process called internalized homophobia, where I'm actually feeling that I am less than because I am a gay person. And that process is going through in my mind. And discrimination. You know, the thing that we understand is that even within communities that are discriminated upon, that there's discrimination that they do amongst themselves. And so we've got these mixed communities coming together and multiple minority statuses that are actually preying and putting more internal pressure on people who identify as LGBTQ. So for those of you who have been working in the community or trying to work with the community or stay updated on the community, there are a million words that you're expected to know. How many of you feel flooded sometimes? Right? Okay. So here's what I want us to do. I want us to kind of break it down a little bit so we can build a vocabulary together and simplify this conversation. So, I know. The thing that someone told me once about this slide is it actually looks like it could be me as a little kid. Yeah, it's not, but it could be. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Let's look at biological sex. So biological sex, we're simply talking about the biological, genetic, or physical characteristics that define males and females. We're talking biology here. We're talking about primary and secondary sexual traits. Now, the thing that's really important to understand about biological sex is that we have been taught this idea that there's either male or female, and those are the only identifiers we have to play. But there's been this really cool recent study that came out that looked at, we identify male and female as the top of a bell curve. But on each side, there are all kinds of different biological and physical traits that are also showing up as male and female and other that we need to take into account. We have said male and female because it's convenient to talk only about the top of the bell curve, but our conversation today is about including the rest of the bell curve in our work. So gender. Gender are the social, psychological, and emotional traits, and they're influenced by the society we live in. So gender is actually a cultural construct. Let me give you an example of how it works. Answer this question for me. Real boys don't cry or play with dolls, okay? Little girls wear dresses, pink, okay? These are all cultural constructs that we have all agreed to. So let me give you an example from my life, because I think it's always the best way to share information. So Glendale is like the biggest gathering of the Persian Armenian community outside of the homeland. And when I would go there, I live in Pasadena, I'd go there and I'd see all these, we're getting real, you ready? I would see all these incredibly hot men. And I would see them walking down arm in arm together down the street. I would see them kiss hello and goodbye. And I was like, damn, this looks good. Okay. But what I learned is that the Persian community is actually violently anti-LGBTQ. Somebody's phone is saying hello. So if I had followed my instinct of what I thought I saw, I was actually putting myself in danger. So that's a social construct difference of how we view what gender plays out like. Now I want you to think about like your world, like where you grew up. Are there constructs that showed up in your world either through your religion or through your cultural stories that play out? Anybody have one that they'd be willing to share? Yeah.
I was brought up in Logan, Utah, 95% LDS, and it's a mix of sin and illness, even to the day. And there's a huge revolution within the LDS community where just recently the church started to question its policy of not allowing children of gay couples to be baptized into the church. And it was a very difficult problem. It seemed their discrimination against black people to come up with some solution. I'm not sure what the solution is, but to this day they still practice conversion therapy.
So looking at LDS, a religious organization that puts statements about what gay people are and aren't in the world. That's a construct created by religion. Anybody have a cultural one? Because I'm always fascinated to hear people's experiences. Anybody got one from your cultural story? Well, then I'll share one more real quick. So my previous partner was Hispanic, and we were embraced by his mom as a couple. We were there. But whenever we went to the big family functions, my partner's mom would always say, look, I'm okay that you're a gay couple, but don't tell anybody else in the family, because they'll think askance of it. Well, that's my word, not hers. But that idea that we were embraced in one place, but we were slightly damaged when we got into the bigger story. Okay? That's, once again, another cultural construct of how we create gender and stories about sexual orientation. Do you all know how pink became a girl's color in the US? Oh, okay. So, up until around before World War II, pink was seen as a more gender-neutral color. If you've traveled in Europe at all, you've seen pictures of like male or female identified people in pink christening gowns. It wasn't seen as a gendered color. But with World War II, while the men were off fighting in the war, women were actually being involved in industry. They were working in factories. They were being invited into this kind of new identity of who they could be in the world. Well, when the war finished and the men came home, there was this movement that we had to re-feminize women so that they could be there to support their men who were coming home from war. And thus, Elizabeth Arden Pink showed up in the world. And pink became this very soft, feminizing color. And we've been living with that since about the 1940s. Okay? I just think that's really cool. So moving on. Gender, external. It's part of our social construct. Gender identity is actually our internal sense of ourselves, of being male, female, some of both, or maybe neither. So where the gender as a social construct comes from outside, gender identity is inside us. It comes from our personal way of expressing ourselves through the world. Does the difference between those two make sense to you? Okay, good. So gender expression. And because I work with adolescents a lot, this is one of my favorite places to work with these kids. Gender expression is how we show that gender identity, that internal sense of who we are to the world, either through what we wear or how we style our hair, through our mannerisms, through how we place our voice. All of these things, these interactions, are us expressing that internal gender identity. And if you think about it, each morning when you choose what you're going to wear out into the world, you are deciding how you are going to express your gender into the community. So this is one of the ways we do it. Now, I want to include sexual orientation. Very important to understand that gender identity, what we've been talking about so far, and sexual orientation are two completely separate subjects. Now, a lot of times in popular Media, you'll see them put together and mixed. But for us, we need to understand gender expression, my idea of being male, female, some of both, some of neither, sits here. My sexual orientation, the people that I want to I'm sexually attracted to, our emotional, romantic, or sexual needs, completely different part of a puzzle. The best way to look at it, you can write this one down because it really helps. Sexual orientation is who you go to bed with. Gender identity is who you go to bed as. Does this make sense? Okay. Keep this little phrase in the back of your brain. It's a beautiful filter to help you walk through your world. So we're going to continue on with a few more definitions. This is the longest acronym I've been able to find so far. That is a lot for anybody to learn. It is. And it's constantly growing and changing. So we're going to concentrate on about the first third of this. So how many of you grew up, do you remember the show Electric Company? Okay. So Electric Company had this amazing thing that they did, and they'd go like, duh, og, dog. Anybody remember that game? Okay. We're going to do it together now. You ready? Okay. So L could stand for lesbian. Okay? So lesbian we identify as a female-identified person whose emotional, romantic, intellectual, sexual, and physical attractions or behavior are with another female-identified person. Okay? So this is like the more complex way to say it. A lot of times people simply say women who are attracted to women. But I'm using words like female-identified because we're including gender into this question right now. So that would be L for lesbian. G would be for? Thank you. So gay would be a male-identified person who has romantic, physical, intellectual, sexual, physical attraction behavior with another male-identified person. So there's an interesting thing that plays out in the community. A lot of times the word gay is used as an umbrella term. Quite a few years ago, many female-identified people thought their needs were not being met by that community, and often they will identify as lesbian. So that's why we use these two different nomenclatures in this conversation. Next, B. I have a question in the back. Yes?
Why do you include the term intellectual? I mean, was it on there? But I noticed you said it in bold. I'm wondering what that's all about.
Because I think attraction is multifaceted, and I think intellectual attraction is part of the thing. It's actually one of the things I was attracted to in my husband. The second date we went on, I went into his bedroom, and there was a thing of Oscar Wilde collected short stories. I fell in love with him a little bit more. So that's why I include it, because I think it's a multifaceted thing. Often when we say someone is gay, the first thing that goes through people's minds is, oh, John says he's gay, he sleeps with other guys. That is not all I am as a gay man. So that's why this multifaceted approach is part of my definitions. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay. B. Bisexual. So we're looking at a person now who has emotional, romantic, sexual, intellectual, or physical attractions to more than one gender or sex. It's really important for all of us to respect this identity as bisexual, because often it's turned into a joke. Often they'll say, you know, someone's bisexual, they just haven't come out yet. But there is a vibrant, amazing, and lively bisexual community, and it's important for us to respect and meet these people where they're at. Another fascinating thing that happens with bisexuality, oftentimes, let's say a female-identified star comes out in Hollywood as being bisexual. Usually it doesn't affect their marketability because most women aren't bothered by it and most men find it a little bit titillating. But if a male-identified star comes out as bisexual, often it will affect their ability to work because it will be where women might take them away from being a sexual object and men can't quite codify what it means for them. So coming out as male or female-identified person as bisexual has very different journeys. So be aware of that when you're having these conversations. T, transgender. So thinking about what we talked about earlier, transgender are simply individuals whose gender identity differs from the biological sex they were assigned at birth. This word assigned is really important in this conversation. Because what happens, we're going to go back into the old times. Someone would have a baby, doctor would grab it, hold it up, slap its bottom, and say, it's a boy, it's a girl. That delineation was made simply on external sexual organs being observed. What we understand now is there's so many more components into this conversation about what that biological sex is. So that's why we use the term assigned at birth. Earlier on, you heard me identify myself as a cisgender person. And for a lot of people, this cisgender, transgender question gets a little bit overwhelming. So we're going to break it down. And how are we going to do that? We're going to go back to the Latin, because Latin just tells you like it is. So cis and trans are Latin-derived prefixes. Cisgender, cis, simply means on the same side of. So what it means is that my assigned birth sex and my gender identity, my internal sense of my sex gender, are in alignment. That's a cisgender person, alignment. Trans simply means on the other side of. That's all that prefix means. So what we're saying is that my assigned birth sex and my gender identity are not in agreement. Why did we start using cisgender? Because for years it was transgender people and everybody else who was normal. And do you see how pejorative that is to a community? So by now putting us all on the same plane, saying cisgender, transgender, it makes it a much more respectful conversation. So that's why knowing what your personal identity is, so you could do what I did and introduce yourself when you're meeting new patients, new clients. You can say, hi, my name's John Sovec. I'm a cisgender person. You can bring that into a conversation. Okay, let's go a little bit deeper now. These are the ones where people's brains start exploding a little bit. Gender nonconforming, gender non-binary. So this is a person whose gender identity does not necessarily meet with society's expectations of what should look like male or female, based on that gender binary. And when we use the definition of gender binary, we're usually kind of just looking at the like computer language, zeros and ones. We're saying there's only male and female. And what we're doing in the GNC, GNB world is we're blowing up that binary and saying that does not apply to how I define myself. There's an amazing, amazing gender nonconforming vlogger in England. And their thing is people often ask me, am I male or female? And I say yes. And I think that's a brilliant way to handle that moment. Okay, we've got a couple of cues coming up. First cue could be for queer. You heard me use that word to identify myself. So queer often plays out on the idea of people who don't conform to normal expectations of gender or sexual orientation. And it's often taken on by people as myself who are advocates, educators, and activists in the community. This word used to be a word that the world would put us down with. And what a lot of us have done is we've decided to re-own that word and say, you can no longer put me down with it. And that's why queer is assigned to a lot of people who identify as activists. Now, the thing about the word queer, it is very personally sensitive to a lot of people. I identify myself as queer. My husband identifies as gay. Important to understand that if you start throwing around the word queer and it hasn't been brought in the conversation, especially with older identified LGBTQ people, it might be seen as offensive. If I walk in to say, I'm queer, you can call me queer all you want, okay? But if you use that word to address someone and they haven't given you permission yet, it could be a little bit dicey. Just kind of giving you a heads up on that one. The other cue could be for, this is a very well-educated group. I love it. Okay. So questioning is an exploratory phase that takes place in the coming out process. It's really where we're looking at our sexual orientation and gender identity. And it's a really important developmental phase. If you kind of think of the Erickson model, identity versus role confusion, those kind of adolescent years, this is where that questioning can come into play. And what I think is so powerful is rather than just walking along a path of assigned gender and sexual normalities that our parents and grandparents have handed to us is that people today are asking themselves personal questions. Who am I and how do I identify? And I think that's really empowering. And that's where questioning can be a beautiful phase to be meeting clients. I love how the crowd gets smaller with that answer. Okay, so intersex is when the biological sex does not correspond with conventional expectations of male or female anatomy or genetics. It's the modern word for hermaphrodite, and it's actually much more prevalent in the world than you think. It's about 0.25% of the population. So when talking about intersex, the important pieces are anatomy and genetics. It's also understanding that for a lot of intersex kids, it's a very traumatic experience for them. Because what will happen is when they're born, they'll be assigned a gender based on either the doctor's wishes or their parents' wishes. And they will be living that gender even though they might have dual genitals going on, internal testes, pieces like that. At puberty is usually when we start to see some of that development happening, and then these kids are in a very, very lost space, and then families have to come together and have a conversation about what's going on. Now, we're sitting here in California. You are all really a well-informed person, but I have to tell you this, that there are still facilities around the country that are basically removing one set of genitalia, usually based on parents' wishes, or doctors telling them that if they don't, that the kids could be exposed to cancer. We know this not to be true, okay? But it is still happening, and it explodes my mind that this is still happening when we know this is not scientifically correct. Okay, A could be for asexual, ace. So asexuality is a person who does not experience sexual attraction. Now, it's different than celibacy. Celibacy is saying, I am sexually attracted to people, but I'm choosing not to act on it for personal reasons. Asexuality means I actually do not have that sexual attraction towards other people. Now, asexual is a big umbrella term, and under it there are all kinds of little other definitions that can play out and create personal experience with this idea of asexuality. An example might be demisexual. Anybody here demisexual? Not a one. Okay, so demisexual is someone who doesn't have physical attraction towards another until they have an emotional connection to that person. So I have to get to know you, I have to get to experience you, I have to start feeling towards you, and then I can have sexual arousal. Okay? So that's just one of the pieces that comes under this umbrella. And the final A is for ally. And I like to have this in here because an ally is someone who is a supporter of the community who's seeking understanding and education. And that's what we're all doing today. So you officially can all call yourselves an ally today. So as I look around the room, I'm seeing brains exploding. So I want to pause for a moment and give you guys a chance to ask some questions. I think we have a microphone somewhere so the rest of the room can hear your questions. We've got one up here already. So just bring it in. We'll start here and then we'll come over.
So I've been trained that hermaphrodite had negative connotations to it, and that's why we moved to intersex. But I've never heard it used in any derogatory way. I was just wondering if you could talk more about, why that's a negative term, or I don't know, any understanding around that, because I just feel like my parents or other people would understand better if I could just use that in conversation, but I'm trying to avoid it, and it's just tricky.
So I don't know if I would know what the negative connotations of hermaphrodite would be, but I would say that intersex is more scientifically and biologically correct. So perhaps that's where the conversation piece comes in, is saying we're just being more accurate, just like the same we're using cisgender and transgender. So we're choosing to be more respectful towards the community and addressing them in a way that's more respectful to who they are. And I'm one of those people that I think it's really important for us to help our parents along, to help all different generations into this conversation. Because the more that we can adjust as a society, the easier it's going to be for someone like myself to come out in a supportive environment. We had a question over here. My mind's kind of blowing that you're like running the mic around right now. It's like, he's the leader of this place.
Hi, I'm wondering if there is a psychological piece to asexuality or any kind of historical perspective.
So asexuality has actually existed historically for myriad generations. And what we're looking at is an idea that although we live in a society that's based on lots of sexual innuendo being in the world, think of advertising, movies, books, all the media you see are based on sex. But there is a really powerful statement to be put into place to understand that there are people who that is just not a natural biological reaction for them. And we have seen it show up sometimes because of prudish societal expectations. If we look at Edwardian England, and those are more like a social, I would put that more towards celibacy. But it's not a mental disorder in any way. It's just the way that a mental biological system are working together.
It's not a childhood issue.
It does not. The question was, is it a childhood issue or maybe trauma-based? Now, can there be trauma-based reactions like this? There absolutely can. But to say that someone who identifies as asexual has a trauma-based story in their past is not being 100% respectful to their story. So I would not put those two together. Okay? We have a question here.
If you have a client who you can tell their family is not being supportive, how can you help the client, I guess, have their family be more supportive? I know that you're in the room with the client, and so I just wanted to get your perspective on that.
Could I hold that question right lightly back here? Because we're going to be talking about that a little more deeply further on. Are you okay with that? Yeah. Okay. Anybody else before we move on? Oh, we got one right back here.
I was just trying to kind of understand regarding the asexual, and I think you mentioned the demisexual?
Demisexual, huh?
So that is totally different than the asexual?
It's something under the umbrella of asexuality.
Okay.
It's one of the other identities that lives under there.
Okay.
Okay?
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. We doing good? Oh, got one more over here.
Where can I learn more about the myriad of categories that fall under asexual?
There's really, really great definition guide on the PFLAG national site.
Okay.
PFLAG is Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. And they have some of the most supportive, easy to read material on these topics. I share it with a lot of parents who come in a panic situation, trying to understand more about their kids' experience. So PFLAG is a great, great, great resource to find. They've got a great glossary. That's a really good place to start. Okay? So if you're all okay, I'm going to move on. Wait, got one more?
I used to have a client who assigned at birth as a male, and once he turned 20, he want to be female. So he changed. He going through the process to change to sexual change, but he is still in love with want to have sex with female. So he called himself a lesbian.
Mm-hmm.
Is that sound right?
That's absolutely correct, because remember, gender identity and gender expression are separate tracks in sexual orientation. So an assigned male at birth person who identifies as female is a female who is attracted to women, and she's identifying, are those her pronouns? She is identifying as a lesbian who's attracted to other women. Okay? So remember, this gender piece and the sexual orientation piece, we often mix them together, but they're separate pieces of identity. Make sense? Okay. So I'm going to move us on a little bit, because there's a lot more to talk about. Now, I do not know anybody in this room's sexual orientation. I don't know your gender identity. But I want to ask this question. Now, it's interesting because this slide always does get that little laugh because you're like, yeah, no, I didn't have to. But that's an actually important thing for some of you who identify as straight in this room or cisgender, is to know that I, as a queer identified man, have gone through a process of development that you have not gone through. That process is something where I have to, as I go through high school, rather than just like, I go through, I see a girl, hey, I'm going to ask her out, it's all kosher and good. I see a guy, I think he's really cute. Let me ask my friends, have they heard anything about him? If I asked him out, would he like beat me up? Would it be okay? You know what, I'm not going to date anybody. I need to just like disappear out of this story. I've had to go through that process. I have had to question and learn about my identity. So anyone who's in the LGBTQI community has had these experiences of having to come out, which is a very internalized process of self-discovery. And as we're going to be looking at now, there are myriad places along that process. And remember, coming out is a lifelong process. It is not a one-and-done experience. If you think about it, me standing up in front of you and identifying as a queer cisgender man, I had to come out to all of you. It's a lifelong process. So we need to understand that this is part of what's happening, and that anywhere along that process, there are stumbling blocks that could bring up issues of self-esteem, of doubt, of lead us into substance, because we're trying not to deal with these identity pieces.
Being disingenuous is a survival strategy prior to that coming out. And it seems that might play a part of substance use disorder as well.
Yeah, the being disingenuous could be part of a hidden identity that leads to substance use. So let's look at, there are lots of models about coming out. So the original kind of like foundational model was the Cass model. And the Cass model came out in like 1979. Now, I bring the Cass model into the room because I think it's important to have a general overview of it, but you also need to understand some of its weaknesses. It was created for basically white gay men coming out. It does not have a multicultural context to it, and it also doesn't take into place all of the variables that exist in modern society. But I will tell you this, all of the models that are previously built are all based on this foundation. Your job today is not to actually memorize this. I just want to lightly bring you into it. So in the Cass model, there's a stage called identity awareness. This is where we start being aware that we're feeling a little bit different inside. Like I'm noticing like boys at school, but other people aren't describing that they're feeling that. So I'm noticing my difference. Then identity comparison. We're starting to look at how our feelings and emotions are different from those who identify as heterosexual. Like we're running these columns side by side. Like what's going on here? This is a phase where people are starting to gather information about what it would mean to be perhaps gay or bisexual or transgender, and what it would look like against a heterosexual cisgender model. Then we're looking at identity tolerance. And this is where a person starts to tolerate the idea that they might be non-heterosexual, non-cisgender. So this is a rough little transition period that's starting to come into play. Then identity acceptance. This is where we start to identify that this new identity becomes more active in the LGBT community. We're starting to see what it would be like to belong to that community. Then we have identity pride, and this is one of my favorite places, especially working with adolescents. This is where we become proud of the identity and we become fully immersed in the LGBTQ community. I'm just going to share a quick story with you. So I had a client, and they came to me like a lot of my kids do, that they had attempted suicide, and from the hospital, they'd been referred to me. As we were working, because he came out in the hospital, as we were working together, he became much more comfortable with his identity as a gay male. And in that process, one day, I think we met on Tuesday, and that night he went home and went online and bought every piece of LGBTQ identity, jewelry, shirts, baseball caps that he could. So he bought rings, he bought necklaces, hats, t-shirts, jackets, shoelaces. And then he proceeded to wear all of those to school at once. That's identity pride in a nutshell, okay? It was beautiful and powerful and wonderful, and he went to a school with a no tolerance policy, so he felt very safe and protected. And then the final piece of the CAST model is identity synthesis. And what this does is it takes that identity pride model, and rather than making the number one piece of who I am, I now identify as a therapist, a husband, a baker, a yoga teacher, a dog owner, someone who loves to garden, and I'm queer. So it takes and lowers its priority in my sense of having to express into the world and becomes a fully integrated part of who I am. So that's what synthesis is. So this is the CAST model. Another model that's out there quite a bit is the Dowgley model. And this has a lot of the same concepts as the CAST model, but it's done in a lifelong, expansive, continuing, ongoing style. So it doesn't say that this happens in a linear manner, but that it keeps moving as we're growing as LGBTQ identified people. Question? I knew you were going to make me do that. D-A-U-G-L-L-I. Dowgley. Close enough. Okay, so now we have another model here, and this is looking at a lesbian identified development model. Now, all I want you to start noticing here is there are words like awareness, exploration, deepening commitment, synthesis. These are words that are popping up in all of these models. And then another model, this is the transgender developmental model. Once again, we're seeing awareness, we're seeing exploration, we're seeing integration. There are all of these powerful words that are playing out in this model. And I want you to think about this. So I'm someone who potentially is having to deal with this, and I'm asking to have exploration, synthesis, integration, awareness, acceptance, and pride. And yet I'm not feeling that inside myself. Think back to the kids we talked about earlier. I'm feeling bullied, I'm feeling shamed, I'm feeling anxiety. I'm constantly hypervigilant because I'm checking for my safety in every experience that I go through. Is it safe for me to walk home from school by myself? Oh, I don't know, because those guys were yelling faggot at me earlier. I've got to find 3 friends to walk home with me. How in the world am I supposed to do this when I'm living in this almost trauma-based model? What are some of the coping mechanisms that might show up? You probably see this all the time in your work. So here's mine. I put it number 1. I put so much stress on myself to be a perfectionist, because if I could be perfect, you couldn't make fun of me or find fault with me being gay. So perfectionism was one of my strategies. We also have a drive for success. We have control. We have emotional distancing, ambivalence, isolation, and the reason we're all here today is substance. The thing to understand, though, is that substance is a reaction to all of these pieces we've been talking about. And I bet when you're working with substance issues, you see all of these other pieces playing out, especially in group process. Okay? So be aware that these might be my survival mechanisms because I've lived in a traumatic experience. You know, coming out is a really tough thing. I was sharing a little bit earlier, and it negatively affects through stress, depression, suicidal ideation. It can bring anxiety models really high up into a person's experience. It can lower self-esteem. We talked a little bit about this idea of internalized homophobia. The idea that my internal sense says, I have become the very thing that you have been making fun of me for. And how do I justify and work with that within myself? Stigma shows up when we come out. Experience of discrimination and violence are ongoing repetitive stressors for LGBTQ individuals. And it's important to understand that being LGBTQ is a minority identity. And that minority identity adds additional stressors. And many people are living in a multi-minority status. There's an intersectionality that we need to be really aware of in these conversations. The idea that I might be a person of color and bisexual. How does that play out in my world and my experience? When I walk into your treatment room, are you going to discriminate against me because I'm a person of color or because I'm bisexual or something else I haven't even thought about yet? My awareness is heightened when I walk in to meet you. So multiple minority status, that thing that the CAST model wasn't looking at, is something we really need to include in our conversations. And also this risk of suicidal ideation is much higher in the LGBT community. You know, earlier I told you about attempts in teens. There's another survey that was taken of college-age kids who were very, very comfortable in their LGBTQ identity. And almost 60% of them identified that they had considered suicide as an option. So that number is really high and really, really unacceptable in this process. And that's where our work can hopefully step in and create places where that doesn't become the only answer to a solution. Okay. So right now, as I look around the room, I see a lot of this. So we're going to open up a little bit more question time, and then we're going to take a 10-minute break. So usually I put the break thing is nobody wants to ask questions, but I want you to ask questions. So anybody have any thoughts, concerns, questions, ideas? We've got one over here.
With the 60% rate of suicidality in the community, do you think that there's possibility of their own self-hatred in regards to their identity and recognizing who they are and their feelings about it, and they don't like it, and they're not accepting themselves?
So I'm going to pull that apart as what I believe I heard.
Okay.
Help me out if I missed something here. So yes, is there internalized homophobia? Is there my own personal internal disgust that I've become this very thing that is criticized and put upon in society? That can be part of the question. It can be part of the motivator. Is it the only piece of the puzzle? It is not. If I'm on a college campus and I'm walking, actually, now let me give you a personal example. So when my husband and I walk into a restaurant together, now we're both very comfortable with who we are, but when we walk in, there's this moment where we have to kind of sit down and then kind of signal, and you can see the moment the staff figures out that we're a couple. You can see that moment, it's like, ah, okay, couple. We now know how to serve them at this table. Those constant low-level stressors are omnipresent in an LGBTQ person's experience. And those are also factors that are going to be included in this idea of suicidal ideation. It's going to make it, if I'm living under these pressures every single day, not just the big ones, but these little microaggressions that are happening on a regular and constant basis, then of course that's going to eat at my internal sense of self and make suicide a potential option.
So how did that, okay, well, I understand where it may stem from, but when you compare the community to other cultures, like there are people, I'm Mexican, so that maybe don't want to identify with that culture per se, I'm curious about the suicidality and the percentages on that, because I think there's a low-level sense of aggression and stress that other cultures, groups, minorities, we'll say, experience just the same, but is the suicidality rate similar or on par? I mean, I just kind of wondering about all that in terms of the psyche.
Right. So anytime there's a disconnect between the identity of who I actually am and the parts of myself that I want to put away and the parts that I'm willing to be open and accept to, are always going to cause internal stressors and anxiety. And I am sitting up here as a white cisgender male. Can I speak from experience of being of a community of color? I can't. But what I can address is the idea that in the clients I work with, there are these ideas. in black communities, men who have sex with men often do not identify as gay. Why? Because the community does not embrace or accept them. And so understanding that all of these stories are layers upon layers of who we're working with, but being willing to open up and ask those questions. Because I just threw out a term, men who have sex with men. Go, you have a comment.
So I just understand you saying that some men do not identify as gay. So can you explain the term down low, what that means, please?
Okay. So on the down low means that the term we use is MSM, men who have sex with men. These are men who have sex with men, but do not identify as gay. So that is another term for doing it on the down low, where I've got this secret life. I may be married, I may have a family, I may be a leader in the community, and then I have this other part of myself that's a sexual need where I have sex with men. They do not identify as gay. And we, as clinicians, need to be able to meet them there and not try and force this story of like, well, if you're sleeping with men, you're gay. Because that's not who they identify as. And I actually have a really good friend of mine who's a very highly recognizable person who has a beautiful family, has like, I think they've got like 7 grandkids now, has sex with men as part of their own like self-fulfillment, but does not identify as gay, as never has. So it's an interesting term to try and wrap your head around, but once again, it's about us not influencing the story that's in the room. A lot of times parents will approach me and say like, well, you're an openly queer therapist, are you going to make my kid gay? It's like, well, first of all, I don't have that power, and second of all, it's not my job. My job is to create a space to meet your kid where they're at and help them self-identify and create a fuller version of their experience. Okay? I think I saw another question somewhere. I've got one here, and then I've got one here. Oh, wait, the microphone's coming.
In this CAS model,
Mm-hmm.
I was a little bit questioning about this pride stage.
Mm-hmm.
This is because this group of people were ashamed in the past. So in order to overcome, you have to feel pride of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, for instance, any kind of a group of people, like how do you call it? Social pyramid. White male is the top of the pyramid. So anybody else underneath, they were somehow ashamed of themselves. In order to overcome, that means they need to feel proud of themselves. Not just acceptance is not enough.
Mm-hmm.
That is my question.
So I push back against the word acceptance. I do. And why do I push back against it? Because acceptance, when I hear it, and I want you to think about this, means I'm accepting you in spite of this little flaw you have. Whether you're a redhead, or you're overweight, or you're a far-off distant relative, or you're gay. Acceptance means I'm bringing you in spite of this default I see in you. For me, the idea is embrace and affirm. Okay? Now, you said all people. I'm always wary of the words all people, because I cannot speak for all people, and none of these studies can speak for all people either. What we can do is look at this idea that it is an experience we're going through. And part of what the CAS model is saying is for a lot of people, there's this moment where we're like, it bursts open. The butterfly comes out of the cocoon, and I am now proud of my identity. And I want to show it to the world. So that's a step that may happen with a lot of people in this idea of I want to own this identity 100%, and no matter what you say or do, it's not going to influence that story. Okay? So that would be my thought on that. We're here, and then I'll come back over here.
Okay, so I'm wondering what therapists and drug and alcohol counselors might do inadvertently to make the patient or client feel uncomfortable. If you could give us some examples, and how can we perform our tasks best for the patient?
Can I hold that lightly? Because we're moving into that. It's like, here's $20 for the transition question. We are. That's where we're moving into next, how we can now support our community. There was another question hiding somewhere, right there. And I'm holding on to your question, too.
I just wanted to, in terms of those stages of identity development, if you could, can you put ages onto those stages, I guess?
No, because it's a lifelong process. And remember, we have kids who are identifying as transgender in elementary school. I have someone I'm working with now who's 40 years old and is coming out as gay. These are processes that can happen anywhere along the life experience. Okay?
Yes, how can we support, as young kids are developing, how can we be more on the front end of that?
So the question is, how can we be on the front end of supporting kids? I think part of it is our openness and being willing to have the conversation. So looking at the idea, does your office space have anything that identifies that you're LGBTQ affirming? You're here today, you're having this conversation. When you walk into the room with your clients now, are you going to feel a little bit more aware and affirmed? Are you going to be able to perhaps step up and say, how would you like me to identify? What are your pronouns? Asking these simple, inviting questions to create a space. You may wonder why I start off with, my name's John, I'm a cisgender queer man, my pronouns are he, him. What it does in most environments is it opens up an awareness that, hey, if there's gender or sexual orientation questions in your world, you've just put out that language that says, I could come talk to you. And I think it's a really affirming practice that we can bring into our daily interactions. Whether we think we're in a very cisgender straight environment or we think we've walked into a very queer environment. What if we started practicing it everywhere we went? Every time you meet a new patient, if you're comfortable self-identifying, hi, my name's John. It could just be, my name's John, I'm a cisgender man, my pronouns are he, him. You don't have to put in the sexual orientation piece. Up to you. But that could lead to the idea that then someone you're working with could say like, oh, maybe I'm not ready to do it now, but they've laid the groundwork, or someday I could come back and say, so remember when we were talking about that, there's some questions I have. That's one of the ways that we can invite that space to start existing. Okay? So we're going to take a break now, 10 minutes, and then we'll all come back together and we'll move on to the next section of action to support our community. Okay? Thank you all.
Since we've gotten a lot of since we've gotten a lot of requests for John's presentation slides, etc., if you get your email to me when you leave, we'll send you his. He's got a PDF version of his information. So if you want that, give me your email and we'll send it to you. So let me introduce real quick so we can get back to this great presentation, Cheryl Canby from the Meadows.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thanks again, Dr. Gelbart, for having us. And we're going to another year, 2020, with the Meadows co-hosting this event. As I do every time at this event during the break, I will give you just a short overview of the programs. I have a table with information at the back as well. Meadows has been around for over 43 years, treating trauma, relational trauma, childhood trauma is our focus at the Meadows. We have 5 inpatient level of care programs in Wickenburg, Arizona, all dealing with different specialties. It is inpatient in terms of the license, so that's full-time nursing and psychiatry. However, we're not a locked psychiatric facility. We are insight-oriented and treatment-focused. Relational trauma, addiction, dual diagnosis, codependency, process addictions. We have 2 gender-specific programs for sex and love addiction, a men's program called Gentle Path at the Meadows and women's program Willow House at the Meadows. And our eating disorder program for women and young girls is called the Meadows Ranch. And then we have our young adult program for ages 18 to 26 called the Claudia Black Center. Outside of our inpatient programs, we do have a little something for everybody. So we have a retreat center for clients that don't need an inpatient level of care but want a therapeutic retreat, 5-day intensives. We have 17 different workshops at our retreat center, which is separate from our inpatient programs. So you have somebody that wants to have sort of a therapeutic experience with the Meadows in only 5 days, which is obviously less expensive than an inpatient stay, let us know. And then we have now 3 intensive outpatient programs, one in Scottsdale, Arizona, that's a network with all insurance, and then Sunnyvale, California, Northern California, we just opened in Dallas. So we're gonna be expanding in the intensive outpatient realm. Our model was developed by Pia Melody, and we also have senior fellows that clinically inform what we do at the Meadows, Dr. Bessel Vanderkolk, Peter Levine, Dr. Patrick Carnes, who runs our sex addiction programs, Claudia Black, obviously. Dr. Richard Swartz just joined our team as well. He's a developer of IFS. I will say that Dr. Bessel Vanderkolk is going to be here in Southern California. He'll be speaking at the U.S. Journal Conference in Newport Beach next week. So he'll be a keynote speaker, I believe, with Janina Fisher, talking about trauma down in Newport Beach. I don't have flyers for that, but if you come by the booth, I'll give you some information about that conference down in Newport Beach. We're also networked with TRICARE, so we've had experience with working with the military, active duty, and veterans for many years. If you have any questions, give me a call or come by the booth and say hello. Thanks a lot, Dr. Gelbart.
Okay, John?
It's me, I'm back. So it's interesting that they were just mentioning about trauma-based programs, because I do want to lightly touch on trauma as part of this story we're discussing today. So what we understand is that the body has a trauma response system. There's a sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. One of them helps our body to respond to stresses, to bring all our chemicals up, and the other relaxes and puts us down. But the thing that we understand also too is that they're supposed to work in a rhythm and an alteration. So we get stressed out, we feel this energy come up, and the sympathetic system says, aha, danger, and the chemicals are released, and our body blood flow changes, and we're there. But then once the trauma has moved on, the parasympathetic system goes and says like, whew, take a breath, release, and the chemicals move out of the body. But trauma interferes with this rhythmic balance, and it makes them so these systems are not working correctly anymore. And responses to trauma often become very automatic. And they're a result of neurons firing in patterns. They're often baked in responses, where we may not be responding to what's actually happening in the moment, but we're still having this traumatic response in our body. And I want to take you back to where we started today, this idea of LGBTQ kids being exposed to trauma at a very young age, of living in hypervigilance because of their internal sense of their identity, which they may not have shared to the world yet. And the idea that cortisol and adrenaline are constantly running through their bodies, and they're constantly checking in for safety. This is a trauma-based response. And if those trauma-based responses get baked in at an early age, we as an adult may still be having these responses, but not even knowing where they're coming from. And one of the ways we soothe those traumatic responses is through substance use. So brain circuitry will be continually reacting to these trauma-based stories for years and years to come. And our limbic system and our responses to these threats may not seem logical, they may not be reasoned, they may not be thought out. They become automatic behavior. And especially those who are working in treatment systems, you see those automated responses show up, especially in group process. Because things are triggering in the group, because perhaps as an LGBTQ person, when I'm in that group process, what I'm feeling is the same trauma I felt when I was starting to identify as queer. So we need to be aware that that may be happening in that moment. So what are the responses that come up? Well, the first one is freeze. And freeze is this initial response into a traumatic situation. And it's kind of that deer in headlights moment. We pause, and we take in tons and tons and tons of information. And in that taking in information stage, we're not actually able to take action. And there are often people who get stuck in this freeze phase, a space of shutdown, of not being able to be present. And then we have flight. And this is where the defense cascade starts to play out. And we may choose the best way to be safe right now is to run away from the situation. The thing I want you to contemplate, though, is not just physically running away. Sometimes the running away is an internal process of checking out. So you may have that vacant client who's not responding to anything because they might be in a flight response where they're checking out of the system. And then we have fight. And fight is this response that wants to take on you as a clinician. It wants to take on the world around us. And you have those clients who show up, and they have this anger rolling out of them. But what we've come to understand is anger is actually a secondary emotional response. That what's going on underneath is the primary response, and maybe that's where conversations of what it's like to be in an LGBTQ experience would help to ease out of some of that anger. So what are some of the benefits of coming out? Well, you could live more honestly. You could develop some self-esteem, build genuine relationships. It relieves some of that stress and fear, and it allows us to find community. And community is a really vital part of self-care. It helps us to survive when we feel like we're less than. There are risks to coming out too, though. There can be rejection. You can be disowned by a family. We could feel discrimination, harassment, abuse. We could lose a community we grew up with. We could lose family. We could lose schoolmates. We could lose social. And a big piece of the puzzle that we need to always pay attention to is if I have someone who grows up with a strong religious background, if I come out, I may lose that community. And that may be part of the fabric of who I am. So we as clinicians need to be aware that that can play out in this process. So how can we support someone in our work? Well, we could work with them to start to come out to self again, to create an environment where they can start having deeper conversations about what it may feel like for them to be LGBTQIA. So learning how they can create a family of choice. Develop a healthier awareness of an LGBTQ identity. Look at what are the social constructs, what are the stories that are told about being queer in the world? And how can we dissect that and make them into a more personalized experience of what it would be for me to be queer in the world? Also, we kind of flash through some of those coming out models. I find that sometimes when we psychoeducate our clients and talk to them about the idea of, well, you know, they're actually like models of the coming out process, that they're fascinated by it. And they like to look through it. Once again, CAS is so fascinating because people can identify to that very easily. So a lot of times they'll be like, I'm in that phase. And having something scientific on their side can help ease some of the anxiety. So talk about coming out models with your clients. So as they start to release some of the trauma-based story, looking at encouraging more social engagement. A lot of times it can be something as simple as, like, well, is there a place in your community? Up in Hollywood, there's this really great little coffee shop called Cuties. It's kind of a hub of like the gender nonconforming community. And a lot of the kids I work with end up going there as a place for the very first time to be around other gender nonconforming kids. So finding a place of community to help make your experience more real. And start to practice positive self-description. It's really fascinating how often minority communities accept the dominant community's story of less than and then start to use it to describe their own experience. So what we can do is, how can we get a client to have a more positive self-description, to decide who they are as a powerful human being, and then to try and let that radiate out into the world. So in this next thing, we talked about coming out to self, but also, well, can we help them come out to family again? Can we help them develop a plan on how to come out to their family successfully? Maybe to reenact things that didn't go well in the first place, to learn and come together and educate parents, educate self. But the other caveat I put in there is, well, coming out to family again or not. Because for some people, it will never be safe for them to come out to their family. And that is a reality that sometimes we have to walk with clients down that road together, to look at questions of safety. As much as I walk through the world and have a really, really optimistic view of how the world plays out, I had to be really aware that for some clients, this idea of potentially reconnecting with family and coming out again is not a safe thing for them to do and not in their well-being. If we were going to come out to a family again, what we could do is in session we could start practicing that coming out conversation. What would it feel to sit down with a brother, sister, mom, dad, aunts, uncles, and start saying these words out loud to them? Understanding that we have a complete lack of control over somebody else's response. We will put out what we believe are words of power. And the people receiving them may sit there and be like, I don't understand, I don't get it, or it strikes something in me that's not comfortable. So we need to help our clients understand that they have a complete lack of control over their family's response. And once again, pointing this out, really important to me, also discuss any potential safety issues. Because we need to make sure that this person has a safe environment in which to come out. And then expedite family sessions. Be there. Be a person who can really watch for that kind of pejorative language that can come out. Watch out for that stuff that's putting down or making less than. And instead, encourage there to be a little bit more balance in the room. A little bit more ability to talk equally and openly. So what are some of the unique challenges that we have in treatment? Well, there are high levels of stress in any treatment experience, okay? Those of you who work there, those of you who've been through it, you know there are huge layers of stress that play out in just being in treatment itself. So sometimes what we need to do is we need to give a little space for that stress to start ameliorating, and then we can start moving into some of the deeper conversations. There are going to be social prejudice. Any treatment center is a microcosm of the world that people live in. So if we have a primarily straight identified residential treatment center and a gay person comes in, all of the factors of social story are going to play out in any type of group process and how that gay person becomes a part of that community. And in that feeling of otherness, it may cause huge blocks in their ability to actually move successfully through treatment. There are lots of discriminatory laws. We're in the state of California having this conversation. The state of California is really supportive of LGBTQ people in treatment. It's not the same around the country. Different centers have different responses. Different states have different laws. There are going to be huge family of origin issues that are going to play out. There may be lack of healthcare competency. If you have a transgender person in your care, do you have the abilities and facilities to allow them to have a high standard of health care, not just mental health care? Sometimes inappropriate services show up in even well-meaning centers, things that are asking people to identify pieces of themselves that may not be known. I'm going to come back to that because I have a thought. Poor treatment team protocols. This is where the thought was. It is really important that in your treatment teams that you learn how to reflect respectable language to your LGBTQ clients. We all know sometimes in treatment team we shorthand. And that shorthanding can often be based on somebody's unique qualities. But I encourage every time I work with a center, in your treatment teams, can you bring respect for all of your clients into the room? Can you make sure that you use their correct name, their correct pronouns, and bring all of those pieces into the treatment conversations? Okay? I've been on treatment teams myself, and I know how easy it is just to try and shorthand. But bring this respect into your treatment team conversations. And the same stigma that someone may face in the world is going to show up in treatment. Once again, microcosm of a whole world. And then we're making a step in the right direction here, but often there's a lack of training in treatment centers and treatment programs. And just having a friend or a cousin or a relative who's gay does not make you a well-trained therapist to work with this community. We do have to have ongoing regular training as part of how we can be supportive of LGBTQ people in our treatment programs. So how do we create affirmative states? Well, first of all, what if we didn't assume that the client was heterosexual and cisgender? What if that wasn't our first assumption when a client comes into our space? What if we created a space where people had the right to define their own gender and sexual orientation? and not based on our social constructs or preconceived notions. How would that play out? Respect people's gender identification and their pronouns and names. So when someone introduces themselves or someone identifies that these are my pronouns, you use those pronouns on a regular and ongoing basis. Challenge anti-LGBTQ comments and conversations. So I've shared with you that I'm an activist in this world. And when I hear people kind of making side comments about my LGBTQ community, I will oftentimes step in. But I'm going to be completely honest. I would say I do it about 75% of the time. There are moments when my anxiety, my stories, my stressors, my trauma experiences get in the way of me stopping a story. But if each of us in this room could do a small percentage of saying, hey, by the way, that joke you just made, it might be offensive to someone in this room, that might be a way for all of us to build a stronger community together. Listen to the stories and experiences of LGBTQ people. There's amazing stuff online. There are amazing series on Netflix and Amazon Prime. There are all kinds of opportunities for you to meet this community and learn more about them and be interested in those stories and how they play out. And be willing to express your support for the LGBTQ community. Be willing to step up and say, I support this. So in creating a safe space, what are some of the ways that we go about doing this? So as we're doing today, knowledge of LGBTQ issues. One of the things that I think can be really challenging as someone who goes out and speaks and does a lot of trainings is a lot of organizations see this as a one and done thing. It's like, okay, we had John out, we did a training, we're now LGBTQ affirming. What I want to suggest is, as many of you have talked to me during the break, this is a fast moving conversation. There are language shifts and changes and new knowledge that's coming up daily. We are at a really exciting place in the transgender community because we now have longitudinal studies that are coming out, 10-year, 15-year studies that are giving us really deep and luscious information to be able to work more powerfully with this community. And so continue getting knowledge, bring in, have another training. Be knowledgeable of relevant services in your area. Who could you refer to as part of an exit plan? Who's in the area that could offer support for an LGBTQ client that you're working with? Initial respect for your client. I love everything we do. I love all the different modalities that are out there. But for me, often it goes back to Rogerian principles of having that positive, unconditional, positive regard for our clients. Their story may be different than mine, but what a joyous place that I can be present with them in this story. Awareness of unique challenges in LGBTQ recovery. We talked a little bit about this. Willingness to make referrals. So I will guarantee that in this room right now, there's at least one, maybe two or three of you who are a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of being supportive of an LGBTQ client. There may be family stories, there may be religious reasons for this. If that's you, self-identify it, know it. Be willing to learn, but also know there might be a block for you being able to be the most effective clinician for that person. And if you believe some of your personal beliefs will get in the way, then make referrals. And whenever I work with educators, I always talk about this. Adolescents have an amazing bullshit meter, okay? So if you sit there and try and pretend like, yo, I'm cool and down with it, they're going to know that you're not. And in that knowing that you're not, they're going to feel a certain sense of distancing from you. So that's where I ask you to do an internal search. Look inside yourself and see what your biases and agendas might be towards working with the LGBTQ community. And then be willing to make that connection with your client. It's so cool. We get this opportunity to meet people in really unique parts of their lives and then journey with them. And connecting with clients is part of that powerful experience we all get to have. So let's look at what practical things can happen. There were some questions about practicals earlier on, so let's step into them. Staff training. For me, staff training has to land on all levels of an organization. So it's from front desk staff to nurses to doctors to the billing crew. So use of gender-free, gender-neutral language on the phone at first contact. There's something that's been going on today, and you may not be aware of it, but I'm going to point it out to you now. In our conversation today, except for very specific examples about specific people, I've been using very gender-neutral language in the conversation. And people always say, oh my God, it's so hard to use that gender-neutral language. It can be. And we can also challenge ourselves to work with it to be a little bit more gender-neutral. To be willing to say client, patient, person, them, they, okay? Everybody, instead of, ladies and gentlemen, please sit down. Everybody, could you please sit down? Simple things like that are adjustments you can start making that when you do it, you're going to become really aware of the places where you don't do it. My biggest downfall for years is I use the word dude a lot, okay? I have learned how not to do that. And whenever I work with adolescents, I work with some really cool adolescent retreat programs. I always say, if I use dude today, you guys get to throw paper at me. Because it's the only way I can become self-aware when it's popping out, when it shouldn't be there. Another really powerful thing is learning to use open-ended questions when questioning clients. So how is the most inviting open-end version that we can ask a question versus why? So when we do interrogative why questioning, it puts a person on the spot. But when we ask how, so you've described yourself as bisexual, how does that look in your world? How does it feel? How does that show up in your daily experience? The how questions leave this open-ended space, which takes our judgment out of this space and allows our clients to express themselves more deeply. So learn and let the staff start to ask how questions. Regular updates on LGBTQ health and social issues. There's a great resource online called the Liebert Press, L-E-I-E-B-E-R-T, and they put out regular gay and lesbian online journal releases. They do a transgender release, and they come out weekly, and they have all the latest research and articles that you can then link to and read through. Great source. So you saw earlier, I introduced myself, I used my pronouns, I identified my sexual orientation. Well, what if that became part of a normal office interaction? What if that just became the language of you and your staff? That is how you introduce yourself to people. How could that change the experience of LGBTQ clients showing up in your office? The pronoun puzzle. Okay, avoid specific gender markers. How may I help you today? Even if you hear a voice on the phone that sounds female to your ear, you're making an assumption about their gender that may or may not be true. So a gender-neutral statement. How may I help you today? Politely ask if unsure. How would you like to be addressed? Simple, respectful questions. Asking respectfully about those names. So a lot of times if people are using insurance or because of hospital policies, JCO, pieces like that, we have to chart under the name that they were assigned at birth. So we have to learn how to respectfully walk that line. Is like, could your chart be under another name versus denying that the name they're giving you exists in your system? Once again, using gender-neutral language. Using they instead of he, she until sure or identified by that person. So I often hear the people saying, but the they thing, I don't get it, I don't get it. Let's show you how this can work. So here's a lovely gender-neutral coffee mug. And it's there. And we look across and we say like, oh, someone left their coffee mug. Do you think they're going to come back and get it? Should we put it somewhere so they can get it later on? Guess what? That's gender-neutral languaging. Do you see? Make sense? Okay. So we do practice it on a daily basis ourselves. It is about getting used to and applying it on our daily experience. So let's look at your office space. I talked earlier about like having things around that might make it easier for people to identify. So what about magazines that identify LGBTQ awareness? Gender-neutral bathrooms. Brochures and collateral materials. and looking at a visible non-discrimination policy. So a few years ago, I was going through some medical issues. I was with USC, and when I went in for an appointment in January, they had put up their new non-discrimination policy right on the front desk, and in there it said gender and sexual orientation. And I saw it, and it made a difference to me as a queer-identified person about what this office was saying to the world. So a visible non-discrimination policy can be subtle, but it will be noticed. Let me go. We have another question session just in a bit. You okay? So finding imagery that supports local resources. So what's around your center? And can you find imagery from there that you can have as part of your decor, part of your area, so that people know you get that there are resources in the area? These are all things that are subtle, but send messages to me and my community to say, hey, we're here to support you. Okay. So there's always a big question about forms. We can gender neutral forms more easily than you imagine. And the kickback I usually get is like, well, our computer system can't. So the UCLA Transgender Medical Clinic, we have gone through and we have worked with this and we've created this beautiful gender neutral, powerful language for them. They're a big system. If they can do it, we can do it, okay? So what will be on your form? You can put name. And then you can put what I call documentation name. I purposely don't use legal name because this is the name that they were assigned by their family. I use documentation name because I think all we're doing is documenting with it. We say legal name, that's a little bit challenging. And I want you to understand that in the transgender community, if you use my old name, that old name is often identified as a dead name. And it can be really traumatizing if you continually address me by my dead name. And so be aware, you can do this. A lot of systems, what they're doing is they are putting the name of the client on the file, and then internally, they're putting either insurance name, documentation name, legal name. So that everyone who picks up the file will be using that person's real name, but for all the other reasons that you have to turn in paperwork for, the other name will be accessible. So it is very doable. In your intake forms, make room for alternative family structures. So most of us assume this idea. It's like, who are you married to? What are you doing? Kids, stuff like that. Well, what if you have a person who comes in who's part of a pansexual throuple? I just saw the room go, what? So a pansexual person is someone who may have a larger relationship dynamic than just a one-on-one person. Okay, polyamorous person. So we need to make room for them to describe these larger family structures without feeling they're so outside the norm of description. And create flexible gender descriptors. So what do I mean by that? A lot of times, forms will look something like this. Now, this is actually from the Lyon Martin Center, which is one of the best transgender care centers up in San Francisco. And they have all these different variables that a person could choose from. But there's a big problem with this particular form that came to light a few years ago. Anybody see what it is? Yeah. It's the word other. Anybody in this room ever felt the energy of being othered? Either by some part of who you are, either physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, where you've been othered. And what that other word does is it puts us away from it, isolates us. It doesn't make room for our full expression of who we are. And we feel like we're trapped over here and everybody else is on the other side of that wall. So othering, if we could remove it, how could we do that? Well, one of the ways is to move back to that open-ended question idea. To create questions on our documents that are actually written answers rather than a checkbox. So how do you identify your gender? That could be a question. Rather than the one we had before, let you self-describe it to us. How do you identify your sexual orientation? Once again, allowing the client, the person coming to see you, to give that identity and that definition to you as a way for you to meet them more effectively. And then how do you describe your current relationship status? This space of creating a line with the ability to give a narrative of these pieces of myself can be really powerful in intake form, and you would often get much more information than you would if there were just checkboxes. So this could be a direction that you could move. So I've given you a lot of information, kind of got a little bit fast here. There's going to be room for questions now. But right now, you may be feeling a little bit awkward. The thing to understand is that this whole idea of gender and sexual orientation, it's a really complex thing. I know many of you generationally may have grown up in a world where it seemed to be all black and white and simple, binary. That's not the world we live in now. And it is a complex thing. So we have to create space where we can have these deeper conversations. Individuals have the right to define their own gender and sexual orientation. So it is not my ability to label you. It is your ability to define yourself that I encourage every one of you to respect in the work that you're doing. As you respect that identification, it gives you the opportunity to actually get closer and connect and learn from these clients. And that's a really powerful, powerful paradigm. Challenge gender and sexual orientation stereotypes. When you see them show up in your world, be willing to challenge them. Don't let it be the status quo. Also understand, this is an evolving story. I've actually heard a couple of people say this, and I want to bring it in now. For years, we would say the word preferred pronouns. And that was everybody being like on with the community and getting it and hearing it. We don't use the word preferred anymore. That changed about 3 years ago. Why? Because the word preferred kind of gave this almost flippant idea. It's like, these are the pronouns I prefer versus these are my pronouns. So we don't say, what are your preferred pronouns anymore? We don't put it on questionnaires. We simply say, what are your pronouns? Okay? Make sense? So the word preferred, gone. Let's see what kind of crowd this is. I know you're feeling a lot of stress right now, a little anxiety. And you probably, okay? Here's the deal. If you're in a situation and you're feeling a little bit awkward or uncomfortable, breathe. Just take a moment and breathe. You'll get through. If you maybe misgender somebody, apologize. Ask for help. I'm sorry, could you remind me what your name and pronouns are? Catch yourself and own it. And when unclear, ask. The thing that I want to encourage in you, though, is, so let's say you misgender someone. And you're like, oh, I'm so sorry, I just misgendered you. I didn't mean to. I know better. Let me go back and look at the chart. Okay, right, these are your pronouns, right? So all of a sudden, you've made it all about you. Keep it simple. It's like, I'm so sorry. Can you remind me of your pronouns? Got it. Make it about a connection versus this idea of fear in yourself. Okay, so I can tell by the room, we're at this stage again. So if my microphones are ready, let's open up the floor and see what kind of questions, comments, concerns, experiences you're having with what's going on right now. I think we got right there.
Could you talk a little about the differences in engaging LGBT in the process of recovery and relapse prevention, certain things that may distinguish gay recovery from somebody who's not gay?
Mm-hmm. So for me, the very first part of that process is kind of the journey we took today, is understanding where they are in their own self-identity. That can be worked out primarily in individual therapy often. And then we also need to understand, well, a lot of treatment is in group process. As I said earlier, is a group process potentially re-traumatizing for your LGBTQ client? And if so, how do we address that and get them into a system that more effectively will support them? It might mean that they need more regular ongoing individual therapy at first. It may be that you need to refer them to an LGBTQ specialization center so they can feel the community is present. One of the things that happens too is this idea that we move from a society, a community that I talked about that is very, very like substance and alcohol centric. And now I'm not using that. How do I fit back into the gay community? How do I find my new place? There is specifically within the AA community, there are LGBTQ specific meetings that we can try and connect into. Once again, knowing the resources in your community. And being aware that these potential levels of trauma may exist in this person's experience. And to use trauma-based modalities as part of their healing process. We talked about how some of those things will show up. You know, perfectionism. How do we release that? Well, what if that was a trauma-based response? If I can be perfect, you can't make any fun of me as a gay person, which was my internal story. That was my faulty thinking. The more perfect I can be, that gives you no opportunity to make fun of me. So we need to look at some of those faulty thought structures. But usually actual trauma-based modalities can be really effective, looking at EMDR, looking at brain spotting. Even simpler things, if your program doesn't have access to that. I know this sounds so like simple, but exercise is an amazing way to work with the trauma-based response in the systems. And there are actually specific things that work really well. Things like running, biking, elliptical, pieces like that that are rhythmic in their movement actually help the body to release the chemical responses to trauma pretty effectively. A lot of people suggest yoga. I'm a yoga teacher myself. I think yoga is a later modality in trauma response work because sometimes when we take into these mindful and yoga places, what we're actually doing is setting someone in a minefield sitting with their trauma. So trauma-based responses can be, modalities can be really effective in working with LGBTQ clients who are facing some of this internalized homophobia and having lived in this world of hypervigilance. That's my longer than I thought it was going to be answer. Okay, anybody else thoughts, curiosities, questions? Yeah.
Well, forgive me, but I was under the impression that this was, the main topic was around the substance abuse of the community, the LGBTQ, et cetera. And I'm a little bit confused how it is so different working with that community, because I'm hearing the same terminology, trauma-based, which we know at the root of substance abuse, there's always something that they're medicating, right, through their substances. And I'm just kind of confused about the position you're taking as though we're to approach it differently with the community, other than the fact that, yes, let's be sensitive to the fact that they have different stands on their sexual orientation, just like any other minority community, be it racial, etc., male, female, even gender. So I'm just trying to understand how we bring it all together and back to the main topic of this conference, and that is the substance abuse matter and how to treat them best, other than, again, I'm feeling like it's more of a being culturally sensitive. Now we're being sexual orientation sensitive, so to speak, to this population. But again, I don't hear the tie-in to the substance abuse.
Okay. So if I hear you correctly, I feel you almost answered your own question. What you learned today was the cultural sensitivity of working with this very unique population, of understanding that there may be experiences that a straight cisgender person may not have gone through. Just like if I walked into working with a Hispanic treatment center, there are huge pieces of the puzzle of Hispanic culture and story that I would not know, which would actually make me probably less effective as a therapist working with that community. So all of these pieces of information are all things that we are going to put into our brains and take back to work more effectively. An LGBTQ person sitting in the middle of a straight cisgender group experience is probably going to have a 0 success rate in your treatment center. Because all of these pieces that we've talked about are going to show up in that group and not allow them space to move through their treatment experience. So we as clinicians would need to be hyper aware of those situations. And I think we would have that with other cultural experiences that are walking into any treatment center to understand what is unique about this person's need in this moment. So all of these pieces of cultural sensitivity and awareness are all part of that process and how we're going to more effectively work with LGBTQ clients. So that's my thought on that, okay? We got a question here, and we got a piece over here.
I guess the piece that I struggle with, I have middle schooler and high schoolers that have not come out, who don't have supportive families. And you emphasized on one of the slides on safety, keeping them safe in this. One of them is in a religious school, for example, and she is already telling her middle school friends about her sexuality, and I'm getting nervous. So any stories, tips, hints on how to keep them safe and how to consider that, really helpful.
Okay. So some of the ways to do that is to look at the system we're talking about. So if they're at a religious school, it is about like, you know, I hear your excitement about wanting to come out to everybody. But let's talk about like, which of your friends do you feel would be the ones who would be the most supportive of you? And which are the ones that are the ones who might be a little bit like iffy about it? And to actually like create a strategy of coming out. Well, then I'm going to come out to so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so. But for right now, I'm not going to come out to these 3 people. So we actually look at the system as a whole, and I kind of call it like, we just put the brakes on for a moment, and we pause and decide who are the people that are most going to be their allies. And that little bit of safety can be really helpful. The thing that's fascinating, in public school systems, a kid could be transgender and could be using their authentic name versus their assigned birth name, and the school is actually required to hold that in a public school setting. So a kid may be one name at school and another name at home, but schools are required to hold that confidentiality. So once again, it's about looking at those issues of where you're going to be most supported in this conversation. We look at, it's like, well, I could never tell my dad, but my mom could be part of this conversation, and I know she'll hold my information closely. So really taking it and looking at who are the people in the circle that are going to be most trustworthy and most supporting. So that's one of the ways that I really help kids look at safety. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I want to thank Dr. Gelbart and yourself for being here, and Thelma McMillan. I came out as a gay man at age 40 and struggled with that and being a perfectionist because I'm a dentist. I was drinking regularly, and so I ended up doing AA meetings because I thought, well, that's how I'm going to get fixed. And it wasn't until I found the LGBTQ AA meetings that I started to relate to the community. And the community, quite often, the easiest way to kind of find it is by going to beer busts or going to, you know, alcoholic-based events. And it took me a while to find the non-alcoholic events so to be able to relate to. So here we are amongst therapists, and I work with dentists in recovery. The thing that I wanted to share that you just mentioned was that about the AA groups that do exist, and it was those group therapies sessions that helped me. Not when I was at Thelma McMillan, I was afraid to tell people in my group that I was gay because like, wait a second, he's a dentist and he, you know, is in the choir in the Catholic Church and all that stuff, and I couldn't wear all those hats. But with my individual therapist here and outside of here, I was able to work through those issues, and so it's really important for people to kind of be accepting. So I know you don't like that term, but acceptance is the key to all my problems today, right? And so, you know, so there is a real tie-in to the community and to substance abuse, and it's great that you're approaching that topic in such a positive way, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you. So I think that shows you like a prime example of what we were talking about, this idea that finding our like community can be part of a support system in this coming out of substance use. Yeah, we're going back here. Yes.
I have a client that is a gay young man who was raped a couple of years ago by a gay acquaintance. And every year around the anniversary of the rape, he goes into a lot of alcohol abuse. But during the year, he's still socially drinking also, part of, I guess, the culture. But today I'm understanding more that perhaps that experience of the rape could be in him a homophobic reaction also to his own issues, and how he delves into alcohol abuse to kind of get through that anniversary period. Is that true?
Well, when I hear that, there are multiple layers of that for me. First of all, we know rape is a very trauma-based story. And so we need to look specifically at that trauma. It doesn't really matter between what human beings that rape happens. Rape is a trauma-based story that we need to make sure we're getting the correct support for. It absolutely makes sense that they're using substance to push away from moving into that story. Even if they're able to, 9 months out of the year, be okay with everything, but then the anniversary hits and it all rears itself up again. So for me, my work is less about a gay man and rape. It's more about a person who's been raped, and we need to move into that work really intensely. And that's where things like EMDR and brain spotting can come in really powerful work. And a lot of people are doing trauma-based work in adjunct to their regular therapist. So before I got trained in brain spotting, I had a community of EMDR and brain spotting people around me. I'd work with a client, we'd send them out for that work, and then they would come back and we would bring it all together. So I think the idea is perhaps looking at following, like the tail of the comet, following the story and moving more into the healing from the rape experience and creating a sense of understanding about it. Because there's also another layer here. Sorry, my therapist brain just took over. There's another layer in here we're talking about too, is you talked about the internalized homophobia. So how do I then go out and create relationship or have sex with other men when my internal sense is that this is not a safe thing to do? So there are myriad layers that are playing out in this story. But my suggestion would be to look at some of the trauma-based experience as like the next stepping stone. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes, over here, just itching. They both went like this at once, and it's just like dual itching. Okay, right back there.
Hello. I'm wondering about modalities. It seems like narrative therapy, or what I'm now reading about is a power threat meaning framework, could be useful modalities in the story you're telling yourself or the story you inherited versus the story you're moving towards. Mm-hmm. What do you think about, I don't know if you know anything about the power threat meaning framework?
Well, you're actually talking to a postmodern narrative therapist. So in the narrative world, what we're saying is that the words we use to describe our world are the words that give it meaning. And so in a narrative work, what we're doing is we're taking those words and we're pulling them apart and breaking the story open to see how we want to alter that narrative. So let's say my narrative is the only way I fit into the gay community is by going to bars and having a drink. You had mentioned about trying to find where else you could fit in. So what if we pull that narrative apart and we find other ways that we could describe being a powerful person in the gay community, and then we start moving towards those. And that's a way that we change the description of who we are. So narrative language in this work can be really powerful, and especially because narrative languaging work never assumes that what I have as the meaning for a word is the same as what you have the meaning for the word. So when you use a word to describe yourself, we pause and you tell me what that means to you. And what that does is it helps us to clean up that really, really imperfect thing called language. Because remember, anytime I speak to you, inside of me, there's a version of what I want to say. And then I find these words to hopefully say it. And then it travels through the air and gets distorted. And then it hits your wall of your life story. And then you push it inside, and you hear only what you create. So that's how imperfect language is. So the narrative stuff helps us to meet and really find out what each of those pieces mean so we can create redefinition. So that's another modality of talking, well, what does it mean? How does it look for you to be a transgender person? How does that play out for you? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What are the challenges? And this is a really great way to create conversation and dialogue. Okay? Great question. Narrative question. I rarely get those. Okay. Wait, there's one here.
I have a client identified as a gay, and he doesn't have did not go through the identity development because at 5 years old, he was touched by his brother's friend who's 10 years older, and that's escalated to having sex and everything. So he believed that he is gay, and he never really come out because the parents are homophobic and always, they never go to the North Hollywood, they will call people names on the street, so he have a lot of fear. So at 21 years old, he have another boyfriend secretly, and then at some point, he realized that what happened to him is sexual abuse. And so he make decision that he want to come out. He want to come out because he have a partner, want everyone to accept him, and also to be able for everyone to accept him, he have to disclose about the abuse. So on the same day, he disclosed this and did the file report and go to the court. Now 2 years later, and we're working on this, and he never experienced having sex with women. He doesn't know what to do with the woman. So, but he also would not feel comfortable to be a gay, go to the gay community, and he have internal homophobic. So I'm asking for any tips how to support him. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So the first piece of that puzzle for me is understanding the difference between family of origin, something we all learned about in grad school, and family of choice. So in a moment like this, maybe family of origin is not the place where this person's going to find the support they need. They're not going to find the love, the nurturing, the understanding, the caring that they might require at this really difficult moment in their life. So what we do is we look at, well, what's family of choice? What about this partner? What about people who showed up in their life who have been supportive, including their therapist, as part of a circle of support? And really trying to emphasize that circle of support in this moment as the place where they might get their needs most met. Family of origin may not be able to come through for them. And sometimes when we can understand that and really integrate that at a very deep level, it can make we can let go. Because oftentimes what we're looking for is this perfect family that's going to totally embrace me and love me, and the reality of who my family actually is, and the friction in between is what causes us all this discomfort. So with the possibility that their family of origin may not be willing or at a place where they can move with this, then let's find the support circle in the family of choice. Does that make sense? So that's where I would really kind of make my springboard off into this conversation. Okay? So once again, it's that concept of resourcing. Resourcing can be really, really powerful in all of these conversations. Okay? We have a question over here.
You mentioned trauma as a source for people to look out for, get involved in substance abuse, but you haven't mentioned how HIV affects the LGBT community and presently and in the past, and how that traumatic 3 letters might affect how people think. Can you make any comment on that?
I can, but I'll have to bring up my other 7-hour presentation. Because I actually do the 7-hour HIV course that's required by the BBS on that first renewal. So I actually do that for CAMPT. I'm going to have to make this really tiny. HIV is an omnipresent story in the LGBTQ community. It has been there for years. Now, the disease is different now. It used to be a death sentence, and our work was to be in hospitals and hold people's hands as they were leaving this earth. Now it's seen as a chronic, manageable disease if your body can tolerate the medications and you have access to the medications. That's a huge shift. But remember, we have communities who lost almost every person they knew. And a lot of those people might have been their drinking buddies. Or as they lost them, the only way that I could deal with it was to stay at home and isolate and drink a bottle of wine so I didn't go out and have sex because I didn't know if I was going to become positive. We have groups of people who are of a certain age, because they survived the initial scourge of the epidemic in the 80s, that they walk around with survivor's guilt. And what's the way that I manage that survivor's guilt? I smoke some pot every night to make myself able to go to sleep. So yes, HIV is omnipresent. And then we look at this model of coming out of substance in a world where HIV may have been more of a worry. Now we're in a U equals U world, a PrEP world. U equals U means undetectable, means untransmittable. PrEP is a medication that an HIV negative person can use to keep themselves from having the HIV transmitted to their body. And we're coming out of substance, and we're, first of all, we know sober sex is probably one of the bigger obstacles that our clients can face. But then if we're looking at sober sex from an LGBTQ perspective, where HIV was an omnipresent piece of the story earlier, we've got another huge hurdle to walk through. So that's my 32-second version of that. It's a really deep conversation, though, and it does influence a lot of people who are in LGBTQ recovery. Okay, we have time for just a few more. We're almost there. Yeah.
Okay, I was struck. I watched Drugs Inc. the other day, and they were talking about the San Francisco gay community mostly dabbling in meth, and I thought, are they discriminatory as to which drugs or alcohol they would use? Is that just unique to that area?
So there are things that are called designer drugs, which means that an affluent LGBTQ person might be dabbling in those types of things. You know, looking at ecstasy, MDMA, K, pieces like that. Also, you know when I showed you earlier some of the ways we respond, and I said perfectionism was mine, and success, and all of those pieces? Well, there are a lot of people that I worked with in the LGBT community who do this thing called microdosing with meth. Now, those of you in the community know, wow, really? There's no such thing. But they do these small amounts of meth so they can work 18-hour days, not realizing that meth is one of the most physically addicting substances that's out there. And so they're like, I'm going along, see how well I'm producing? And then months in, it's like I can't not use. So yes, sometimes using those drugs as a response to those things of trying to be the most successful, the most perfect, the most forward, the most there, that this is going to lead to trying to use these things in what they consider a manageable way. And a lot of us know from experience that that manageable beginning gets unmanageable really quickly. And so be aware of that, yeah. Thank you. It's a cool question. I've never gotten that before.
They also talked about, I guess, dating websites for HIV positive to hook up with another HIV positive, so they didn't have to worry about spreading the disease. That was new to me.
Yeah. So yeah, on a lot of the hookup websites, you can describe all parts of yourself as to who you want to hook up with. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you all so much. I know you gave my applause, but I have one last thing I really, really, really like to close with, and it's really important to me. So are any of you familiar with the It Gets Better Project? So It Gets Better Project is a series of videos that were put out by the Trevor Project that say, I've been through this coming out process, I know what it's like, and now I'm an adult and it gets better. And it's a beautiful series. If you haven't seen it, go online, just Google It Gets Better, and a bunch of videos will come up. Sports stars, celebrities, all kinds of people are on there. But the one thing that's so important to me is I think there's a little mistake in that campaign. It doesn't just get better. We make it better. us coming together, us having this conversation, us be willing to talk openly about these issues, that's how we make it better. So my challenge for each of you is to go back to your organizations, go back to your work, take what we've done today, filter it into that, be willing to reach out with more questions, concerns, bring me in for trainings in your organizations, and let's commit to making it better. Okay? That's my final thought. Thank you all so much.